Okay, so for everyone out there who loves to really dig into some deep philosophical questions, things about like what exists, how we know things, what's valuable, well, today we're taking all of that and we're going to point it at, well, something you might not expect, architecture.
Yeah, I think a lot of times people kind of lump architecture in with, art history or maybe structural engineering, but it really does touch on some super fundamental philosophical issues.
Yeah, for sure. And that's exactly what we're going to get into in this deep dive. We're going to explore some of the big philosophical questions about architecture, like what even is architecture, when you really get down to it? What kinds of things do we call architectural objects? And how does all of this connect to the stuff that, well, that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries, like aesthetics, ethics, all that good stuff.
And the cool thing is, we're not just making this up as we go along. We have a fantastic guide for this whole exploration, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, entry on the philosophy of architecture. Yeah. It's like a super comprehensive overview of all the key ideas in the field.
Yeah, definitely. Think of it like we're giving you a map to this whole intellectual landscape, and we're going to trek through it together.
Exactly. And because we know you're already familiar with a lot of the philosophical ground, this deep dive is all about showing you how it applies to architecture, how those concepts you already know can make you see buildings and cities in a whole new light, maybe even have some aha moments along the way.
Exactly. And to get our philosophical brains warmed up right out of the gate, let's start with a question that gets right to the heart of things.
Okay, I like it. Hit me.
Is architecture fundamentally an art form, or is it something else entirely?
Ooh, that's a good one. Because you can argue that it's primarily about design, right, with a focus on function. Or maybe it's more of a social practice, something that shapes how we live together. It's definitely a gateway to a ton of fascinating philosophical questions.
Totally. I mean, I think just starting to think about that question already gets the wheels turning.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so let's really dive in, starting with what might seem like a simple question. What is architecture?
Yeah, and you'd think that would be an easy one to answer, but it's not as straightforward as you might think.
Right. And actually, one of the interesting things you notice when you start looking into this is that, well, traditional Western philosophy, the stuff we often think of as the classics, they haven't really given architecture as much attention as, say, painting or poetry.
Right. Like architecture hasn't always been seen as a primary philosophical playground.
Exactly. So getting a clear and simple definition isn't really easy. And often philosophers will use this phrase, architectural object, as a kind of starting point. It's pretty neutral, and it can cover all sorts of stuff that architects create.
Right, because it's not always just about buildings.
Right.
We have all sorts of designs, plans, models.
Exactly.
And even those can be tough to define.
Mm-hmm.
There's one approach that says, basically, architecture is just whatever architects do.
Okay, so kind of like defining it by the people who do it.
Right. There's this great quote from the architect Cedric Price. Architecture is what architects do. And it kind of pushes us to look at what architects actually do historically and now. And if you think about it, we see echoes of this going way back. I mean, Vitruvius in ancient Rome based a lot of his architectural ideas on the practices of his time.
Oh, yeah. And there are similar approaches in ancient Indian and Chinese texts, too, right? Like they focused on how things were actually built and what architects were doing.
Exactly. And even today, sociologists are studying the profession itself, trying to figure out what makes it distinct.
But if we just say architecture is what architects do, well, that kind of feels a little circular, don't you think?
It does, a bit, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, architectural practice has changed so much throughout history. What was architecture back in ancient Egypt is totally different from what modern architects do.
Right, like the materials, the technology, even the whole purpose of buildings has evolved so much.
Totally. And then there's the whole question of things like landscape architecture, which we definitely consider architecture, but it doesn't always involve those traditional ideas of structural engineering in the same way. Yeah. So maybe we need to go deeper.
Yeah, I think so too.
So another way philosophers have tried to pin down architecture is by searching for its core features, the essential things that make something architecture, not, say, just a pile of bricks.
Okay, so like the basic ingredients.
Exactly. And the classic starting point for this is something called the Vitruvian triad. It goes all the way back to Vitruvius, that Roman architect we were talking about.
Oh, yeah, right.
And the triad is firmitas, utilitas, venustas. In plain English, that's durability, utility, and beauty.
So for something to truly be architecture, it has to have all three of those things.
That's the essentialist view, yeah?
Yeah.
They argue that, to some degree, all three of those have got to be there.
Interesting. And then within that essentialist view, are there like disagreements about which of those is most important?
Oh, absolutely. You have functionalism, which puts function above everything else.
Okay, so if it works, it's architecture, even if it's like super ugly.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
And then you have formalism, which is all about the form and the aesthetic arrangement, how it looks.
So a beautiful building that's totally impractical, the formalist would say, yeah, that's architecture.
Yep, they'd be all over that. But then, both of those views have their problems.
Yeah, I can see that. Like, what about ruins, for example? They might not be structurally sound anymore, and they definitely don't serve their original purpose.
Right. So is a ruin not architecture? And our source even points out that you could have a building that was designed to be functional, but just doesn't work well.
So like a leaky roof or bad plumbing?
Exactly. So it's meant to be useful, but it fails at it. Does that mean it's not architecture?
And on the flip side, what about buildings that are purely ornamental, like just meant to look pretty? They might not have any practical function at all.
Yeah, think of follies, those little decorative buildings and gardens and stuff. And those are often considered architecture, even though they're not really about function. So the essentialist view starts to get kind of shaky when you look at those edge cases.
Right. And then isn't there a whole other line of thinking that challenges this idea of essentialism in the first place?
Oh, totally. Some philosophers argue that maybe there isn't some fixed set of features that defines architecture, but it's all about how we experience it. It's subjective, tied to how we interact with the built environment.
So it's more about feeling than like ticking boxes on a checklist.
Right. And that gets into all sorts of questions about perception, aesthetics, the whole philosophy of mind stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
And then you have an even more radical view, which is nominalism. They basically say there are no essential features of architecture at all. It's just a label we slap on a bunch of different things that kind of resemble each other.
So kind of like, I know it when I see it, but there's no real definition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the reason they argue that is because there's just so much variety in what we call architecture, and it's constantly evolving.
Right. Like, we call both a pantheon and a modern skyscraper architecture, but they're so different in almost every way.
Yep, exactly. So it's quite a philosophical mess, just trying to figure out what architecture even is.
Yeah, no kidding. But let's move on to the next big question, which is, what kinds of things did architecture actually make?
Okay, so now we're getting into the output, the tangible stuff.
Right. And this takes us straight into a debate that's been going on for ages. Is architecture an art form?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Because if it is art, then what kind of art is it? How is it similar to or different from other art forms?
Right, and you have this whole spectrum of views on that.
Right.
At one end, you have people who say architecture is basically just engineering. It's about creating functional structures. And if those structures happen to be aesthetically pleasing, that's just a bonus.
So like a well-designed bridge is just a really fancy way to get from point A to point B.
Exactly. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who say that any designed and built structure is automatically art, which, if you think about it, kind of makes everything from a grand cathedral to like a garden shed into art.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm buying that one. It seems like there's got to be some kind of distinction, right?
Right. And that's where things get interesting. One argument is that the intention of the creator is what matters. If the architect set out to create something aesthetically valuable, then it's art, even if the end result isn't, universally loved.
Okay, so the intention behind it plays a big role.
Exactly. But then how do you determine that intention? I mean, sometimes it's obvious, but other times it's not so clear. And what if the architect had good intentions, but just wasn't very good at their job?
Yeah, that's a good point.
And you have philosophers like Stephen Davies who argue that just because a discipline produces some works of art, it doesn't mean the whole discipline is an art form. He uses craft as an example.
Oh, okay. So like a skilled craftsperson can make something that's considered art, but most of what they do isn't necessarily art.
Right. And he argues that architecture is kind of similar. His primary function is to create useful buildings, not just to make art. But then you have Robert Stecker, who comes back with a counter-argument.
Oh, okay. What does he say?
Well, he says we can totally identify specific architectural objects that are definitely art, even if not every building qualifies. He even reminds us that historically, architecture was often lumped in with the other fine arts.
Oh, interesting. So he's kind of taking a middle ground.
Yeah, he's saying that architecture as a creative medium might be inclusive, encompassing lots of different things, but as an art form, it's probably more exclusive.
Okay, I can see that. But then What about the argument that even everyday buildings can have aesthetic qualities that we appreciate?
Right, exactly. And someone might say that architects almost always have some intention to make something that looks good, even if it's not like museum-worthy art.
Right, right. Like nobody sets out to build something intentionally ugly, right?
Hopefully not.
Yeah.
And, think about traditional vernacular architecture. We see these buildings from different cultures, and we instantly recognize them as architecture, even if we have no idea what the original builder was thinking in terms of artistic intentions.
Right, like those ancient cliff dwellings or those thatched roof cottages. Nobody's questioning whether those are architecture.
Exactly. So it's really tough to find a clear dividing line between what's in and what's out when it comes to architecture as art.
Okay, so we've been wrestling with what architecture is and what kinds of things it produces. Now let's get into something that's probably even more up a philosopher's alley, which is the metaphysics of architecture.
Oh, I like where this is going.
Because it's more than just bricks and mortar, right?
Mm.
There are some really deep questions about the fundamental nature of architectural objects, what they are, in a philosophical sense.
Right. Like, it's easy to just think of buildings as these physical things, but there's actually a lot more to it when you start digging deeper.
Exactly. And one of the first things that's tricky is this idea that architectural objects are just buildings. Because what about things like roads and bridges, or even public squares, or those little market stalls you see popping up? They're definitely designed and built, but they're not really buildings in the traditional sense.
Right. And then there's all the stuff that architects make that isn't even a physical structure at all, like models, sketches, those fancy computer-generated plans.
Right, right. So are all of those things equally architectural objects?
Yeah, that's a good question. And if not, then which ones are the real ones, the ones that matter most from a philosophical point of view?
Yeah, like what's the hierarchy there?
Right. And then you have to think about the relationship between a building and all of its parts, like the walls, the roof, the windows.
And then the context too, right? Like how a building relates to the buildings around it, to the neighborhood, to the whole city.
Exactly. So you see, it's not just about like a standalone object. It's about how that object fits into a whole web of other things.
Yeah, definitely. And then you have this other big philosophical problem that comes up, which is multiple instantiation.
Ah, yes. That classic philosophical head scratcher.
So it's like if you have a musical score, right, and then you have multiple performances of that score.
Right, right. Are they all like instances of the same work?
Exactly. So in architecture, is the work the physical building itself, or is it the design, the plan that the building is based on?
Yeah, because you could have the same building design built in different places at different times, even with slightly different materials.
Right. And that gets into this question of how do we know when something is a genuine instance of a specific architectural work?
Right. Like, is it just about following the blueprint exactly?
Sure.
Or is there something more to it?
Yeah.
And our source mentions all these features like, the historical background, the environment, the style.
And even those can be kind of fuzzy.
Oh, totally. Like, you could have two buildings that look almost identical, but one is a cheap imitation and the other is the real deal.
Right, right. So it's not always easy to draw a clear line.
Nope. And then we get into the really deep philosophical stuff. What are architectural objects in a fundamental sense?
Okay, yeah, let's go there.
So if we say that there are different ways to understand what art objects are, ontologically.
Right, right. Like, are they physical things? Are they abstract ideas?
Exactly. Well, could we define a separate ontology for architectural objects based on what makes architecture unique? The fact that it takes up space, that it's meant to be used, that it's designed.
So, like, maybe there's something special about the being of a building that's different from, say, a sculpture or a painting.
Exactly. And if you're an inclusivist, you might even want to extend this to the whole built environment, not just individual buildings.
Okay, that makes sense.
So let's look at some of the philosophical accounts of what architectural objects are. One view is concretism. They say that architectural objects are basically just the physical structures themselves.
So the bricks and mortar, the concrete, the steel beams, that's what matters.
Right. Or maybe it's the physically realized design, like a scale model.
Okay, yeah.
And this view fits well with the idea that architectural objects are artifacts, things that are made by humans with specific intentions.
Right, right. But doesn't that run into problems when a building's purpose changes over time?
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the big challenges for concretism. Like, what if a building was originally a factory, but then it gets converted into lofts? Is it a different architectural object then?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And what about buildings that get like renovated or added onto.
Right. Or even just like regular wear and tear. A building is constantly changing, even if it's just on a microscopic level.
Hmm.
So how do you pin down its identity if you're only focused on the physical stuff?
Good point. Okay, so what are the alternatives to concretism?
Well, you have abstractism, which is kind of like Platonic idealism applied to architecture.
Oh, okay. So instead of physical stuff, we're talking about abstract ideas.
Right. So they say that each specific building is like a shadow of a perfect, unchanging form. The ideal design that exists in some abstract realm.
Okay, I think I'm following. So the blueprint, the concept, that's the real architectural object.
Exactly. And this view can handle things like designs that were never actually built, or even like imaginary buildings.
I see. So, like, if an architect draws up plans for a skyscraper that never gets constructed, that skyscraper still exists as an architectural object in this abstract sense.
Exactly. But of course, this view has its critics too.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
Some people argue that a lot of architecture is very tied to its specific time and place.
Hmm.
The materials used, the historical context, the whole social and cultural environment.
So, like, trying to abstract away from all of that loses something important.
Right. And how do you even experience an abstract architectural object? It's not like you can walk through it or touch it.
Yeah, that's true.
And our source points out that, when we talk about the Parthenon, for example, we're usually thinking about the actual building in Athens, even though it's a ruin. We're not really thinking about some abstract plan floating around in a realm of forms.
Right, right. So it seems like neither concretism nor abstractism completely captures what's going on with architectural objects.
Right. It's not as simple as either just the physical stuff or just the ideas.
Okay, so what other options are there?
Well, there are pluralist ontologies.
Okay, I think I've heard of that in other areas of philosophy. So, is it the idea that there's more than one way for something to be?
Exactly. So instead of trying to pick one side or the other, they say maybe there are multiple aspects to architectural objects. Like Arthur Danto, the philosopher, he talked about material bases and aesthetic ideas as two distinct but related parts of the whole.
Okay, so you have the physical building and then you have the concept or the aesthetic intention behind it.
Right. And you could even bring in Nelson Goodman's work on notation here. He talks about how plans and blueprints function as a kind of language. And the architectural work is kind of linked to that plan, which can be realized in multiple buildings.
Okay, that's interesting. So there's the plan and then there are the physical buildings that are based on that plan.
Exactly. And then you have even more, let's call them unconventional views.
Okay, lay 'em on me.
Some philosophers say that maybe architecture is more about actions or performances, like the act of designing, building, or even just living in a space.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about the object itself, but about the whole process and the experience.
Right. And then others see it as like a series of events or moments in time.
Okay, so it's not a static thing, but something that's constantly unfolding.
Exactly. And finally, there are contextual or social constructivist views.
Ooh, I'm intrigued.
They say that architectural objects don't exist in isolation, but only within a specific social or cultural context.
So, like, the meaning of a building changes depending on who's looking at it and what their background is.
Right. And how the building is used can change its meaning, too. Think about how old churches are sometimes converted into art galleries or restaurants.
Right, right. So the social life of a building is just as important as its physical form.
Exactly. So you can see how choosing a specific ontology for architectural objects has huge implications for how we understand almost everything about architecture.
Yeah, no kidding. It affects how we think about its physical properties, how we experience it, even things like intellectual property rights.
Right. And it definitely plays a role in how we approach historical preservation.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about what architectural objects are, but there's another important question that comes up. How are they related to each other?
Okay. So now we're talking about mereology.
Mereology, is that like a philosophical term for how things are put together?
Exactly. It's all about part-whole relations.
Okay, I'm with you.
So in architecture, do we focus on individual buildings as the main unit? Or do specific parts of a building have their own separate significance?
Right, like you could argue that a beautifully carved doorway has aesthetic value, even if the rest of the building is kind of plain.
Exactly. And then you have environmental contextualism, which says that we have to look at groups of buildings and how they relate to the surrounding landscape.
So, like, you can't really appreciate a single building without understanding its place in the neighborhood or the city.
Right. And this challenges the idea that the individual building is the primary thing we should be thinking about.
Yeah, I see that. It's more about the whole ensemble.
Exactly. And then there's this really interesting idea of architectural causality.
Causality meaning like cause and effect.
Right. But how can buildings, which are basically stationary objects, actually cause things to happen?
Yeah, that seems counterintuitive.
But our source points out that architecture definitely influences human behavior.
Oh, for sure. Like the way a school is designed can affect how kids learn, or the layout of an office can impact productivity.
Exactly. And a lot of architectural design is based on this very idea that the built environment can shape how we think, feel, and act.
Right, right. So the building is a kind of silent actor in the drama of human life.
I like that, yeah. And then there's the idea that one architectural object can actually cause the creation of another.
Ooh, okay. How does that work?
Well, maybe a building is so successful at meeting a certain social need that it inspires other buildings to be built.
So, like, if a new community center revitalizes a neighborhood, it might lead to other improvements in the area.
Exactly. Or a building could be so innovative in its design that it sets off a whole trend.
Right. And then there's also the fact that planning regulations and zoning laws can dictate what kinds of buildings can be built, which indirectly influences architectural design.
Right. So it's not just architects making decisions in a vacuum. There are all these social and political forces at play.
Okay, so we've explored some of the really deep metaphysical stuff. Now let's shift gears and talk about architectural language and notation.
This is a fun one. The idea that architecture is like a language has a long and fascinating history.
Really? So buildings can talk to us?
In a way, yeah. The idea is that architecture has basic building blocks, like words in a language.
Okay, so like columns, arches, windows, things like that.
Exactly. And those elements can be combined according to certain rules, kind of like grammar.
So there's a right way and a wrong way to put those pieces together?
Some people would say so, yeah.
Hmm.
And then the way those elements are combined is supposed to convey meaning, just like sentences in a language.
Okay, I see. So the architect is kind of like a writer using architectural words to communicate something.
Exactly. And the way we understand those meanings is influenced by social and cultural context, kind of like how the meaning of a word can change depending on who's saying it and where.
Right, right. Like a Gothic cathedral means something different to us today than it did to the people who built it centuries ago.
Exactly. So there are approaches that focus on the syntax of architecture, the rules of how things are put together.
So, like, are there specific proportions or relationships between elements that are considered more pleasing or harmonious?
Right. And there was a lot of interest in this in the 20th century, trying to figure out the underlying grammar of architecture.
Interesting. But then who gets to decide what the right grammar is?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because different cultures and different time periods have had very different ideas about architectural beauty.
Right, right. So maybe there's no single right answer.
Maybe not. And then you have approaches that focus on the semantics of architecture, the meaning behind the forms.
Okay, so what kinds of meanings are we talking about here?
Well, it could be the building's intended function, like a courthouse is designed to convey a sense of authority and justice. Or it could be stylistic references, like a building that uses classical elements to evoke ancient Greece or Rome.
Right, right. So the building is sending us a message even if we're not consciously aware of it.
Exactly. And philosopher Nelson Goodman has this interesting idea that buildings can have meaning through symbolic functions.
Symbolic functions.
Yeah, like denotation, which is directly referring to something.
So, like, a statue of a lion might denote courage or strength.
Exactly. And then there's exemplification, which is showing a quality that the building itself possesses.
So a building made of sturdy materials might exemplify durability.
Right. And finally, there's expression, which is conveying feelings or attributes.
So like a soaring cathedral might express awe or reverence.
Exactly. And then you have the semiotic approach, which sees buildings as signs.
Signs like stop signs or something.
Well, not exactly. But the idea is that buildings communicate information about themselves and influence how we behave.
So like a bank is designed to look solid and secure to inspire confidence.
Exactly. And postmodern architects really embraced this idea. They saw buildings as complex communication systems.
Okay, so all of these ideas about architecture as a language, are they widely accepted in philosophy?
Not really. While there are definitely some interesting analogies between architecture and language, a lot of philosophers are pretty skeptical.
Oh, okay. Why is that?
Well, one problem is that it's hard to find clear architectural equivalents to the basic units of language. Like, what's the architectural equivalent of a noun or a verb?
Yeah, that's a good point. And buildings don't really have a clear syntax like sentences do.
Right. And while buildings can definitely evoke feelings and associations, it's tough to pin down specific, consistent meanings. Like, a classical column can mean different things depending on the time period and the culture.
Right, right. So it's not like a dictionary where you can look up the meaning of an architectural element.
Exactly. And maybe the biggest problem is that there's no equivalent of truth conditions in architecture. Like, how can you say that a building is making a true or false statement?
Yeah, I see what you mean. So maybe this whole language idea is more of a metaphor than a literal theory.
I think that's probably the best way to see it. But even as a metaphor, it can be useful for understanding how buildings communicate with us, even if it's not in a strictly linguistic way.
Right. Like it makes us more aware of how buildings are sending us messages, even if those messages aren't always clear or unambiguous.
Exactly. And it can help us appreciate the artistry involved in using architectural elements in a way that evokes certain feelings or ideas.
Okay, so that's the language analogy. Now, what about notation?
Ah, yes. This is where Nelson Goodman's work comes in again. He thought architecture was kind of a special case because of the existence of architectural plans.
Right, because a plan is like a set of instructions for how to build something.
Exactly. And the intention is that any building built according to the plan would be a genuine instance of that architectural work.
So the plan is like the master copy, and the buildings are the copies.
In a way, yeah. But Goodman himself wasn't sure if architecture was truly allographic, which is his term for art forms that have a notation system like musical scores.
Oh, why not?
Because he thought that things like the historical context and the specifics of the building site play a big role in how we understand a building.
Right, right. And traditional architectural drawings can be pretty ambiguous, leaving a lot of room for interpretation.
Exactly. But here's where things get really interesting. What about digital design and those fancy BIM systems?
BIM.
Building information modeling. It's basically a super sophisticated way to create digital blueprints that include tons of information about the building.
Oh, wow. So it's not just lines on a page, it's like a virtual model of the whole thing.
Exactly. And with BIM, you can get a much higher degree of precision, and you can factor in all sorts of contextual data.
So maybe with these digital systems, architecture is getting closer to being a truly allographic art form.
It's definitely possible. It'll be interesting to see how this technology changes how we think about the relationship between the plan and the building.
Okay, so now let's move on to another big philosophical debate in architecture. Formalism versus anti-formalism.
Ah, yes, this is a classic one. And it gets to the heart of what makes architecture aesthetically valuable.
Okay, so what's the basic idea behind formalism?
Well, formalists say that all the important aesthetic properties of a building come from its formal properties. Things like its shape, its colors, the materials used, and how those elements are arranged.
So it's all about what you can see and experience directly.
Exactly. And our aesthetic judgments are based on that direct experience without needing to know anything about the history or the context or the meaning behind the building.
Okay, I see. And that makes sense in a way because a lot of architecture is non-representational, right? It's not trying to depict a scene or tell a story like a painting might.
Right. It's more about the pure manipulation of form and space.
But isn't there more to it than just the visual stuff?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where the anti-formalists come in.
So what do they say?
They say that things like historical context, cultural background, and even the symbolic meanings attached to certain forms and materials all play a huge role in how we experience and appreciate architecture.
Okay, so it's not just about what you see, but also about what you know and what you feel.
Exactly. Like, think about the Louvre pyramids in Paris.
Oh, yeah, those are a great example.
So part of what makes them so striking is their geometric form, the transparency of the glass, all that.
Right, the purely visual stuff.
But it's also their juxtaposition with the classical architecture of the Louvre itself. This clash between old and new.
Right, and the fact that pyramids have all these symbolic meanings in different cultures.
Exactly. So the anti-formalists would say you can't just ignore all of that when you're making an aesthetic judgment.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not just about the building in isolation, it's about how it relates to everything around it.
Right. And within formalism itself, there are actually different flavors.
Oh, interesting. Like what?
Well, some formalists are really focused on the actual materials and physical